a comment about.
I have for many years thought that capital contains elements. You could, if you a bunch of creatives got together, we could write an opera based on capital. Because there are a number of wonderful vignettes, and you could put together a string of vignettes that make up the whole opera, and that would also help people understand capitalism much better. Let me give you a small example. It is littered with formulations like this. By incorporating living labor into the material constituents of capital, that is to say, a capitalist buys raw materials and other things and labor power, puts them to work together in the process of production. So by incorporating living labor into the material constituents of capital, the latter, that is to say, capital, becomes an animated monster, and it starts to act as if consumed by love. And there are other wonderful references about how commodities are in love with money, but it is often an unrequited love, etc., etc. It's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, and so what I thought I would do today is I would introduce you to a very, very critical passage. It's a passage that is wonderful, lyrical even, satirical, and at the same time it lies at the heart of what capital is all about. Because if you think about the question that Marx asked, or the overall question that governs this work, it is, what is surplus value and where does it come from? Okay, Marx is very clear. Marx says that most of the time people confuse a society that exchanges its products for capitalist society, and he clarifies the difference between them. He says if we are merely a society engaged in the division of labor to enjoy the fruits of the increased productivity it brings, we would be and we are all seeking to satisfy our needs, we would be engaged in something, in a circuit he would call CMC. We have commodities, whatever it is we produce. I produce eggs, you produce ducks, we exchange them, whatever. So we take our commodities to the market, we sell them, and then we buy what we need. So we are taking one commodity, what we produce, and getting another commodity, what we need. It's very simple. However, he says, this is not what typically happens in capitalist society. This is not the circuit that governs capitalist society. That is another circuit, and it looks similar, but it is different in many important respects. Two or a couple of them are very important, and that is MC, M prime or M dash, however you want to say it. There are a couple of differences. One is it does not begin with commodities. It begins with money. Okay, you as a capitalist, you have money. You then want to engage in capitalist production. You go out, you buy the raw materials, you buy the buildings, you buy whatever it is that you need, and you buy labor power. You mix them all together, and you set the production process in motion, and you will get, so you take your M, you buy commodities, you set the production process in motion, and then you get, so in an expanded form it would be M, C, C dash, M dash. You take your money, you buy commodities, you produce more commodities with them. C dash implies that there is an increase in quantity, and then you get M dash, which is more money than you started out with. Here, there is no increase in quantity, so to speak. You will get roughly the products of the same value as you exchanged. Here, you will get more value. You begin with $100, and hopefully you end up with, say, $110. And that is the purpose. Here, the difference is qualitative. I take my eggs to market and I buy bread with it, because I have too many eggs and not enough bread. Okay? Here, the difference is merely quantitative. I put in money. My only purpose is I want more money. Of course, I have to be a good capitalist. If I'm not a good capitalist, I may end up with less money than I started out with, but that's not a scenario we're going to consider. So that's the overall purpose, is to say, how does this happen? It's very simple. Okay. And I should also add that there are two elements to surplus value. One should remember. One is that there is an addition. M is indeed greater than, M dash is indeed greater than M. So there's an addition. And, of course, we know clearly from the existence of capitalists who do no work and lots of workers who do a lot of work, is that there is somehow a transference between the latter to the former, from workers to capitalists. So it changes ownership, okay, in the process. So these are the two elements. Now, if you ask most people, how does this happen? Most people say, well, capitalists cheat us. They don't pay us the full value of our labor. And that's how they get profit. But Marx says that does not really work. He says you cannot explain how this happens. Of course, he does not deny that there's plenty of cheating and that workers are cheated all the time. But he says that does not explain the whole process. How do you get additions? Because if I bring goods of $50 to the market and sell them to you for $60, or vice versa, you bring goods of $50 and I only pay you $40 for it, a transfer has taken place, but there is no addition. The sum total of the number of goods is the same. Okay? So, in that case, then, you have to begin by assuming something which does not always happen, which probably happens less frequently than we imagine, but let's say we have to assume that in the market exchange, there is an exchange of equivalence, that when something is exchanged for something else, they each have the same value. So, now I'm going to start reading the bits that I want to read. Okay, so if you understand this, that you can have cheating, but cheating does not add value. It simply transfers value from one set of hands to another set of hands. So then Marx says, we have shown, therefore, having discussed all this, that surplus value cannot arise from circulation. It cannot arise from cheating in the market, giving less for buying cheap and selling dear, etc. So surplus value cannot arise from circulation, the sphere of the market. And therefore that for it to be formed, something must take place in the background which is not visible in the circulation itself. Something else is taking place which we need to know what it is. And further, he says that there is in fact, yes, at the same time, he then says, okay, if this something else is taking place, it is not happening entirely in the private sphere of one individual producer. Because imagine that I am an individual producer. Imagine I weave cloth, okay? Today, I wove 2 meters of cloth. Now, by working more, I can weave a third one. But and that will increase the amount of cloth I have produced. But there is no surplus value in the sense that I am producing more cloth, but nobody else has benefited from it. So for that to happen, a social process has to take place. And the only social process in that sense is, well, not the only, but that it has to be realized in circulation. So circulation is involved in some fashion. Let me just read you what Marx says. Outside circulation, the commodity owner only stands in a relation to his own commodity. As far as the value of that commodity is concerned, as far as the value of that commodity is concerned, a quantity of his own labor which is measured according to definite social laws. The quantity of labor expressed in the magnitude of value in the commodity, and hence the value reckoned in money of account, this quantity is also expressed by price, 10 pounds for instance. But his labor does not receive a double representation. It is not represented both in the value of the commodity and in an excess quantity over and above that value. He is not producing surplus value, he's just producing more value. It's not surplus value. He says, Yeah, the commodity owner can create value by his labor, but he cannot create values which can valorize themselves. That's value that valorizes itself is this, that you start with M, a value, and by the end of a certain process, it has valorized itself. It has added value to itself. Yeah. You begin with M, you end up with something more than M. 100, 110, etc. He can increase, he can increase the value of his commodity by adding fresh labor and therefore more value to the value in hand by making leather into boots, for instance. The same material has now more value because it contains a greater quantity of labor. The boots have therefore more value than the leather. But the value of the leather remains what it was. It has not valorized itself. Leather does not naturally transform itself into boots. It takes something else to do so. So he says, it is therefore impossible that. So what he's saying is, in production, if you're producing for yourself with your own labor, there is no surplus value. There is no valorization taking place. It is therefore impossible that outside the sphere of circulation, a producer of commodities can, without coming into contact with other commodity owners, valorize value. Do this alchemy of M into M dash. This is not possible. For that, contact with others in the market is a sine qua non. It is a condition of doing that. It cannot valorize value on his own and consequently transform money or commodities into capital, right? M dash. Capital cannot, therefore, arise from circulation, and it is equally impossible, therefore, for it to arise apart from circulation. It must have its origin both in circulation and not in circulation. So he says, he continues then, because this is where he sets out the parameters. He says, what is the challenge of identifying the source of surplus value? This is why he's setting it out. So he continues. He says, the transformation of money into capital, which is what happens here. This is, you start with money and you buy the labor power, the means of production. That's capital, because that's what is being put to use to make more capital. Because in one of its definitions, capital is self-valorizing value. If you put this in your mattress or under your mattress, it's not capital. It is only capital when you use it to make more capital. Otherwise, it's money. You're just hoarding money. That's your problem. The transformation of money into capital has to be developed on the basis of the immanent laws of the exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. We are not going to assume that there is any cheating, there is an exchange of we're not going to assume that there is an exchange of non-equivalents. The money owner, who is yet only a capitalist in a larval form, this guy, who has still got his money in his pocket and has not spent it on anything, he is a capitalist only in his larval form. He must buy commodities at their value. He must pay for what things are worth. Sell them at their value. Whatever he brings to market, this has to be sold at its value. And yet, at the end of the process, withdraw more value, 110, from circulation than he threw into it at the beginning. His emergence as a butterfly out of the larval form must, and yet must not, take place in the sphere of circulation. These are the conditions of the problem, and then he uses this very famous Latin expression, hic Rhodus, hic salta. That is to say, here is Rhodes, leap here, which apparently refers to some Greek tale about some athlete who boasts that he has made a big leap at Rhodes. So his people who are listening to him say, well, all right, show us. Here is Rhodes, leap here. Okay, that is to say, show us what you can do. This is the challenge. Can you leap here? Can you leap, as you say, as long, as high as you say you can? Okay, so where are we now? Right. So since money cannot add value to itself, the addition of value must happen somehow on the other side of exchange. Because remember, in any process of exchange, you have a commodity, eggs or bread, which exchanges for money. Okay? That is by the way, by distinguishing between CMC and MCM, Marx also did something else, which by the way Keynes regarded as an act of genius. People always oppose Marx and Keynes. People love to quote all the disparaging remarks Keynes made about Marx, and undoubtedly he made many disparaging remarks about Marx. But there is a deep similarity between the two thinkers. And Keynes also based his understanding of capitalism on this distinction, although it had to be formulated in a very different way when he wrote the general theory, because between Marx and Keynes, incidentally, those of you who may not know this, Keynes was born a few months after Marx died. This is this is a barter economy, essentially, or it could just as easily be a barter economy. Okay, although money is involved, really you are looking at exchanging bread for eggs or whatever it is. Whereas here, this has to be a money economy, because the purpose is to get more money at the end. Here money is merely a facilitator. Here money is the object. So, and for Keynes, and both Keynes and Marx criticize Say's law, which precisely talks about a capitalist economy as though it were this rather than this. Forgets that money plays an important role. Anyway, so in the exchange, and I'll say more about this in a minute, but in exchange, therefore, there is commodities on the one side and money on the other side. And since money cannot, you put money away in a safe, you put 2 rabbits in a box, maybe, a few months later you'll get many rabbits. But you put 2 pieces of money in a box, many weeks later you're not going to get lots more money, okay? So it does not valorize itself on its own. Therefore, Marx says, since it's impossible for money to do this, we have to look for a solution in the commodities that the capitalist is buying, because somewhere in between here, value is being added. The question is where and how, okay? And it's not money that's doing it. So, he says, right. So he says, in order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, because here he is buying commodities which he will consume productively, but he will consume them. In order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend, the money owner, must be lucky enough to find in the sphere of circulation, in the market, a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labor. That is to say, something that, because when we labor, if I produce this is the objectification of my labor. A series of activities that have duration, that is human activity, becomes objectified in a thing, right? So he says, the possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market. The capacity for labor, in other words, labor power. This is very important, and it took Marx a lot of effort to come to this realization, because most of us think that we buy labor on the market. We don't buy labor on the market. We buy labor power on the market. Whether it's you and me hiring somebody to clean our house, or a capitalist hiring somebody to, whatever, we are buying labor power, because we're not, despite the fact that time wages and piece wages make us think otherwise, actually labor is paid for by the day, by the week, whatever. And what it's paid is what it costs to make it. Which is to say, in human terms, if I'm the laborer, what it costs to reproduce me from one day to the next, so that I turn up once again the next day and work. Yeah? however hard the work is. If the work's very hard, I need more calories, I'll need more food than if I'm doing light work, etc., etc. Okay, so yes, so he does find such a commodity. And that commodity is free wage labor. And this is something also very important to understand. It is free in a double sense. The double sense is very important. Most of us, again, we emphasize that we are free to choose our employers. And indeed, in some kind of minimal sense at least, we are, especially when the labor market is not as loose as it is right now. When the labor market is tight, we have a little bit more choice about which employer we are working for. But anyway, but there is a second freedom, a negative freedom, which is far more important, and it is that we all of us are defined by the fact that we have no other way of making our living, eking out a living for ourselves without working for somebody else. Because an original situation in which all human beings, no matter how oppressed they were, had some kind of direct access to their means of living. A feudal serf, even though he or she may be a serf, did have direct access to the land from which he or she could extract their livelihood. It may be a miserable one, but it was there. Capitalism is defined precisely by the severing. And something recently I wrote, I used an analogy, which is actually suggested by Marx's own works, because Marx says that you cut the cord between the human being and his natural laboratory, which is the land. Yeah, we had some connection to the land, and it is practically like snatching a baby from its mother's breast, because that is our only source of livelihood. And once you cut that cord, it's gone. It's finished. Now we have no other choice. And by the way, this cutting of the cord is a forceful process. Marx describes it in great detail in the famous Part 8 of Volume 1. So we think that in capitalism there is no force. But the foundational force has been so strong as to relieve the need for at least overt force, except when workers are striking and they have to be tear gassed or whatever it is, other things, such things have to happen. Okay, so there is this double freedom. So he says, this is a very, very abbreviated bit, which is further elaborated in the Part 8. He says that the historical conditions of the existence of capital are by no means given by the mere circulation of money and commodities. Just because there exists a market economy doesn't mean we are living in capitalism. It arises only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence finds the free worker available on the market as a seller of his own labor power. And this one historical precondition comprises a world's history. If you want to write the history of capitalism, you have to begin with how in different parts of the world this connection between people and their natural, historically given access to the means of their livelihood was cut, how this connection was cut by one means or another. Capital, therefore, announces from the outset a new epoch in the process of social production. There was one other thing I meant to say about this. Anyway, it'll come back to me. So this is once you cut this, then the value of labor power is basically, as I said, what it needs to sustain the laborer, and this value is historically conditioned. Of course, where you have, naturally a higher standard of living or whatever you may have more, or where workers have struggled to lift themselves out from the most utter degradation to something more decent, you will have a higher standard of living, etc., everywhere. But this historically conditioned cost is known. When the capitalist goes to the market, there is no auction for labor. Labor power, the cost of labor is known. Okay? And cost of different kinds of labor is also known. And now we understand, therefore, we go back to the challenge. Hic Rhodus, hic salta. This is the conditions. Now we are ready to understand what that is. And I'm going to read this passage, explain it, and conclude my talk there. So, So we know the manner of determining the value paid by the owner of money to the owner of this peculiar commodity. That is to say, he has a long discussion of how the value of labor power is established. So now he's resuming and saying, now we know this. The use value, which the former gets in exchange, manifests itself only in actual utilization. That is to say, the use value of labor power is realized by the capitalist only once the process of production is set in motion. Yeah. The money owner buys everything necessary for the process, such as raw material, in the market and pays the full price of it. He buys it, raw material, labor power, etc. He pays the full price, the fair price of that. The process of the consumption of labor power is at the same time the production process of commodities and surplus value. This process, where you go from the originally bought commodities to the additional value commodities, this is the process of production. And it is here where the raw materials and the labor power are consumed by the capitalist. The consumption of labor power is completed, as in the case of every other commodity, outside the sphere of circulation. When I buy my eggs, I don't sit down in the market and eat them. I go home, I make my omelette, I eat it. Similarly, the capitalist who buys all these things and is going to consume them is also going to take away his commodities and consume them in another location. Let us therefore, in the company of the owner of money and the owner of labor power, Marx explains earlier that one of the preconditions of free wage labor is that we should be considered the owner of our own labor power, and therefore we are authorized to sell it. Yeah, this is the legal fiction on which capitalism relies. Because you could have moral issues about selling labor power, right? There may be societies in which this may not be permitted, or permitted only in certain regulated ways. Anyway, we can discuss that further. Okay, so let us part company with the owner of money and the owner of labor power. Leave this noisy sphere. So the hidden abode of production in the title is contrasted with the noisy sphere of the market. Okay, leave this noisy sphere of the market where everything takes place on the surface, in full view of everyone, and follow them into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold hangs the notice: no admittance except on business. Stay out. What happens here is not your business. It's a hidden, even secret abode. Here we shall see not only how capital produces, but how capital itself is produced, because it is not just that capital produces shoes from leather. Yeah? It's not, and a few other things, leather, labor power, etc. It is that capital produces itself on an expanded scale. It gets back its own value plus an addition. Okay, so how capital itself is produced, the secret of profit making must be laid bare. The sphere of circulation or commodity exchange, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact, now Marx is being very satirical, is in fact the very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom, because both the buyer and seller of a commodity, let us say labor power, are determined only by their own free will. They contract as free persons who are equal before the law. This is why in capitalism requires the fiction of human equality. And that is why liberalism, in a sense, oozes out of its pores. You know, a certain liberal ideology oozes out of its pores. Their contract is the final result of their joint will and finds a common legal expression. That's why liberty. Equality, because each enters in relation to the other as with a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Yeah, so that's why it's equal. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own. The capitalist disposes of his own money, the worker disposes of his own labor power. This is what they each possess. And Bentham, because each looks only to his own advantage. The only force bringing them together and putting them into relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, the private interest of each. Each pays heed only to himself. No one worries about the others. And precisely for that reason, either in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things or the auspices of an omniscient providence, the invisible hand, shall we say, they all work together to their mutual advantage for the common weal and in their common interest. As I say, Marx is being very sarcastic, satirical here. Ironic, even. In fact, this passage is dripping with irony. When we leave this sphere of simple circulation or the exchange of commodities, the noisy sphere of the market, with the sphere which provides the free trader vulgaris, that is to say, your average vulgar economist, as Marx used to call them, who only babble on, expressing what Althusser would have called the spontaneous consciousness of the capitalist classes. So he says, this free, noisy sphere of the market provides the free trader vulgaris with his views, his concepts, and the standard by which he judges the society of capital and labor. When we leave this sphere, a certain change takes place, or so it appears, in the physiognomy of the dramatis personae. By the way, Marx also uses these words, dramatis personae, which also makes it clear that he himself is conscious of writing a play or an opera or whatever. He who was previously the money owner now strides out in front as a capitalist. The equality is gone. Now the money owner walks in the front. The possessor of labor power follows as his worker. The one smirks self-importantly and is intent on business. The other is timid and holds back, like someone who has brought his own hide to the market and now has nothing to expect but a tanning.
You can call on the audience.
Sure, absolutely. Maybe while you're thinking, I'll add one other thing. Everybody also complains about, a lot of people complain about capital. Well, two things. A lot of people complain about capital and say, oh, it's so hard to read, etc. And I've said at the beginning, it's not hard. Secondly, everybody also says that this first chapter on the commodity, it's peculiar. Why is it there? What's it doing? They don't understand it. Because it looks as though, especially if a modern person, somebody today starts reading and says, why is he belaboring this point about what is exchange value, what is use value? Isn't it obvious? It actually isn't. Because we are constantly confusing the two. And it bears reading. Yeah, it bears, just follow him. It's actually very easy. The bewildering thing is not that it's hard, but that it's so easy that you don't understand what it's doing there. Okay? And it's there because this explanation that Marx has given of where surplus value comes from, that it basically comes from the fact that the laborer can produce more value than he is paid, that he is worth. This is the secret of surplus value. This would not be clear if you did not distinguish between use value and exchange value. The exchange value of labor power is what you paid for it. Let's assume it's the fair price. The use value of the labor power is what makes capital, what creates this alchemy of M dash. And it is precisely, and I just finished writing an encyclopedia entry on where political economy had left things when Marx arrived on it. And it's very clear. The reason why, what this chapter is doing there is it's there precisely because Smith, Ricardo, they all knew that labor is the source of value. What they could not work out is how, if it's the source of value, how is its use? How does this alchemy take place? Basically, they could not work it out. The could not work it out because although they also knew the difference between use value and exchange value, they did not apply it consistently and they did not apply it to labor.
So I think that was an excellent talk, very clear. You make Marx sound very clear and easy. The distinction, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just a preliminary point, distinction between Smith and Ricardo and Marx, among many things, is Marx's discovery of the concept of labor power, and where they were sort of lost on that issue. But here's a different question. The MC, this hidden abode of production is fascinating to me because neoclassical economics doesn't want to go into the hidden abode of production. They want to stay in the market where these things are exchanged and everybody is putting in what they, everything is fair. They put in they get out exactly what they put in. And what I would, now it is, Marx does not just focus on the hidden abode, but he does shine a light on that. It's very important. But the critical thing, I think, is that under neoclassical economics, the main question is how are prices determined. And
excellent.
I submit that, I mean, that gets into the transformation program and all that kind of stuff. But I would submit that that is a very unimportant issue. In the end, how prices are important, how determined, is a minor compared to the question of looking at it from the point of view of how surplus value is developed and produced, and how capital and the market rule our lives, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like to hear what you say.
Absolutely. I'm very glad to answer this. Before I do that, I've circulated this. I think there are enough copies to go around. Last year, in September, Red Pepper, which is a British radical magazine, asked me to do a review of Capital at its Capital Volume 1 at its 150th birthday. And I was very glad to accept because I've run many Capital reading groups. I've read Capital, and over the previous years, I've developed a critique of how Capital is assimilated, not just by the mainstream, which is not assimilated at all, but even by Marxist economists. So the result was this. So I hope very much, it's very short, and I hope very much that you all have the time to read it. And if you're interested in the matter of the relationship between Marx, neoclassical economics, and Marxist economists, I also have, if you Google Radhika Desai Academia, you'll go to my academia.edu website and find there an article called The Value of Labor and, no, how did it go? Yes, the history of value and the value of history and the history of value. I got a bit confused because originally I had entitled this History and Capital in History, which they removed and put this very boring title instead. But anyway, but it was also very serious. I mean, I just happened to on these very interesting, but please look at that as well. So, on your question, I agree with you that neoclassical economics does not focus on the difference between neoclassical economics and Marx is not that one is interested in how prices are formed and the other is not. Marx was just as interested in how prices are formed. It's a very critical question for him. It's just that they have two very different accounts of it. Neoclassical economics assumes that supply and demand determine price, and they don't have a theory of value at all. I mean, they have this subjective utility theory, which is neither here nor there. It's kind of a bit asinine, really. But Marx actually said that prices are determined in production. And at any given moment, when you're trying, like when I go to buy a dozen bananas, it's not like there's a auction and my demand for bananas makes a difference to its price. No, for every buyer at any particular time, a price is given. And that price is formed in production. And it's important to understand this is not any specific production. But there's a notion called socially necessary labor time. By the way, Marx, one of the wonderful delights of reading Capital is that Marx is a very scrupulous attributor of his ideas. So he attributes the idea of socially necessary labor to an anonymous pamphlet that he read. I mean, he didn't have to. Nobody was going to find it. He could have said, I came up with it, but he would never do such a thing. Because he engaged with the ideas that existed. And I think it's also very good that he didn't, for a variety of reasons. Anyway, so what determines prices? The most important thing that determines price is socially necessary labor. And let's assume that prices are at any given point values, although in reality, not only do they diverge, not only can they diverge, they must diverge in the price form. We can come back to that if you want me to, but it's socially necessary labor. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean, if you paid people by the amount of labor time they spent on producing something, then the laziest and most incompetent worker would be rewarded, which is not how it works. No society can afford to rest on such a basis. So what happens is that basically a price is established over a series of exchanges and production sequences, and that price is socially necessary labor in the following sense, that on average, given average skill levels, average conditions of production, average quality of raw materials, etc., it costs roughly $10 to produce a pair of shoes. And you and I both know this. Let me tell you, let me explain it the way I've found to explain this. If you go to the market and somebody tells you that tomatoes today are $30 a pound, you're going to say, get what? They're not worth that much. What do you mean when you say they're not worth that much? You are saying something you know. You know it tacitly. So that what you mean is that, no, given average conditions of production, average weather conditions, average farming techniques, etc., tomatoes cost roughly, I don't know, $1 a pound, or whatever it is. So there is that. Now, then there is, demand and supply do play a role in Marx's, and by the way, Marx here is no different from the tradition of classical political economy. They do not consider demand and supply to be the arbiters of price. Smith did not, Ricardo did not. And Smith is, by the way, vastly misrepresented by the free marketeers. But anyway, they all agree on this, that it has to do with the production process. So that established the base price. Now, of course, if tomorrow there is a big drought and you can't have tomatoes for love or money, then the few people who happen to have tomatoes will sell them for absurdly high prices. And yes, their demand and supply will play a role, but in ordinary conditions, because remember also, commodities, strictly speaking, are only those things which can be produced in ever greater quantities as necessary. Supposing that you are taking advantage of a temporary shortage in tomatoes by selling them at a high price, well, you may be doing so, but the rest of us are not foolish. Those of us who can farm will bring more tomatoes to the market to try to benefit from this, And but of course, this supply response will bring down the price of tomatoes to their socially necessary level. Do you see? Maybe not, but that's...
Well, I see, but I'm suggesting maybe an off-the-wall concept here, that the source of the pricing, how the pricing is determined in classical versus neoclassical, that's important to understand that. But in the end, the obsession that neoclassical economists have as to how prices are determined is really a problem that is of little importance.
Sure. I think I would also add that their obsession is with price alone. They have no notion of value.
There's no difference between price and value,
Yeah.
is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Or there is in Marx.
Sorry, there was another back there? Or yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this really very interesting elaboration on the difference between use value and exchange value. So I am a senior lecturer at the University of Washington, Bothell, and I have now understood why I am paid for the same amount of labor I am paid at least 30 to 40% less than people who are tenure track. And as a result of which, I understand why the university considers my labor as inferior, and hence why I am surplus.
That's okay. I don't. I have not. I sense the irony with which you're asking this question, so it's not lost on me. Okay, this is actually opening a very big can of worms, which I will investigate briefly for you. At least outline the investigation. Marx. There are two ways of reading Marx. One is to say that Marx considered labor power a commodity. The other is to say that Marx said that capitalism treats labor power as a commodity. Okay? And these two ways of looking at it make a big difference. If you take the latter, then Marx's interpretation, which I do think holds some water, a lot of water, it will be very close to Karl Polanyi's idea that labor, land, and money are fictitious commodities. They're not commodities in the true sense, because if you remember just a few minutes ago, I said that commodities are those things whose value, where there can be a supply response. Even if there is a supply response to a high demand for labor, it takes 20 years before the laborers will appear. Do you see what I mean? So land, labor, and commodity, they are not produced for sale. They are, in that sense, do not have a real production cost, etc. So the scenario you are describing is actually a scenario in which capital is trying to beat down the value of labor power of your type, essentially by taking advantage of what is a loose labor market. That is to say, there is a bigger supply of this particular type of labor, and many other types of labor we are all too aware. Because once you have an oversupply of one kind of labor, then what you have is people will go into education thinking they will get a better job, then there are too many people in another. So that's one element of the question. And the second part would be to say that I think that while in a certain manner of speaking, Marx is right, that, let me rephrase that. Marx basically says that the value of labor power is what it produces, what it costs to reproduce, but he does not say that it will always get this value of labor power. He is very clear that there are times when it will be beaten down to ever lower levels, and that's kind of what we are looking at. So I don't know whether it fully answers your question, but that's the kind. And remember, labor power, as I say, I don't think Marx would be averse to the idea that all three, land, labor, and money, are not real commodities. Because if you think about it, real commodities are those in which there can be a supply response, where there is a cost of production. But in fact, we don't have babies so that they can go and work for somebody else. This is what happens to them, but that is not why we have babies. Yeah?
Thank you for that response. I actually had a comment and then my own question. So, listening to your response, it really reminded me that there was a politics to why Marx was doing this. It wasn't just about a realist description of the world. It was about trying to think of what this meant for the capital-labor relation as a political institution. And we often forget that there are three elements to the kinds of labor struggles that are involved. One was the struggle over the length of the working day. Another has been technological struggles around relative surplus value. But the third has been about beating down the socially necessary abstract labor time you require to reproduce labor. And I suspect that what you're pointing out is that we are in the current moment when many of the attacks on everything from welfare and so on are part of beating down socially necessary abstract labor time. The real wage, which we assume which will not go back up automatically if you beat the social time down. It will not just go back up when the labor market is tight, which I think Alka's pointing out that it behooves those of us with tenure to understand that it is in our interest, material interest, to join in unionization drives that equalize the salaries of our colleagues. So I really want to note that that is important. But which brings me to another political area which I'd love to hear about, which was not addressed directly in the talk, but I was interested in, which is Marx also, when you look at CMC to C prime M prime, he also has an M prime. So there's
MM prime, yeah.
yeah. So there's MM prime, there's MCC prime M prime, and the interesting thing has been the extent to which, in your talk, you highlighted the question of labor power. But it feels to me that a lot more interest today seems to be on finance, capital, and banking, and not that much on labor. And so I was curious about what you think of this political shift of interest on financialization compared to questions of unit and
Okay. I will say that these are huge questions, okay? I'm going to try and answer them. I'm not saying I'm not going to answer them, but you have to remember that. So, point number one, what you said reminds me that something that I meant to say earlier is a point I couldn't remember. Capital is a social relation. This is very important. Capital is not a pile of money. Capital is a social relation, and this is often misunderstood in a variety of ways because, it says, well, people say, oh, well, I know what it means. It means there's people with property and means of production on the one hand and property-less people who must work for them on the other. But it's something more than that. Think about this. Imagine that you lived in a society where you had, imagine that a normal farm which a family could handle would be 100 acres. Now, a family had 1,000 acres. Now, most of us would think, my God, they're very rich. But if there were nobody to work for them, they would be the slaves of those 1,000 acres. They would have to work longer and harder to mine those 1,000 acres. Yeah? The idea that we think that by having more means of production, you are rich, we take it for granted that people are constantly in supply. Workers are... We should not take it for granted because this is not something which is a natural product of history. A long history had to take place, a long history of violence had to take place before this is brought to realization. That's the first thing. Second thing is, and this is very interesting as well, and this is just, it's not Marx, it's me. I would say that we are now living in a time when, especially with China's development, one of the two largest pools of labor is actually already entering a period of increasing wages. There are many products that the Chinese can no longer produce because their wages are too high. India will be next, and quite frankly, being from India, I don't know when that time will come. I hope and pray it will come, but our society is too darn oppressive, too darn class-ridden for that to happen easily. Chinese are different that way. Anyway, but India will be next. But once you get past this, actually what you're looking at is that the West, and generally all centers of capitalist accumulation will need more labor. Yeah? Maybe for us, maybe for this generation, that is too far and not soon enough, but nevertheless, that will happen. Because for a variety of historical reasons, the birth rate is entering its demographic transition period at much lower levels of material well-being in the rest of the world. In the West, the demographic transition is maybe 50 years old, maybe a little bit more. But in many other parts of the world, women are having 2.1 babies at much lower levels of. This is going to limit how much labor is available, okay? So that's just one part of the response. Now I'll come to a couple of other things. Sorry, a couple of other things and then I'll come to you. In terms of reducing the real wage, there are two ways it can be done. Of course, you're more familiar. I'm just reminding you of something perhaps you forgot to say, which is, of course, you can reduce the real wage by cheapening the value. That is, if shirts, which used to cost $10 now cost $5, then you can reduce the wage without reducing the actual material well-being of people. But of course, what is happening now is that it is being, in some sense, both things are happening, because remember the extent to which the residents of this country rely on cheap imports from low-labor countries. So that's also happening, but nevertheless, both processes are taking place. Did I forget any aspect of your question?
Finance.
Finance, yes. Very important. So, I would say that in order to understand the financialization of the Western economies, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow. But for today, I will be very brief. Keynes and Marx, I would say, both agree that financialization, what we call financialization, the increase in M-activity over MC-M- activities, making money out of money rather than making money out of production. This is when this happens, it is a symptom of an underlying crisis of capitalism. Now we can dispute about what are the mechanisms. I think there are many mechanisms, and maybe tomorrow, if I have the time, I'll show you a table of different crisis mechanisms that I had made. But anyway, I would say at least two are very important. One is that I think that the neoliberal era has continued to constrain demand while capacity has expanded. I'm being more or less Brennerite here, and I think he has a point. He's right. Secondly, also, rates of profit are falling, partly also because of this demand constraint. But nevertheless, so basically in most Western countries, capitalism has lost its mojo. And the financialization that we are looking at is a symptom of that. It's not the cause of that, although of course there can be a spiral of causing, etc., but it is fundamentally a symptom of that. And of course, in a variety of ways, this problem gets exported as well and so on, but nevertheless. So to me, what that is also showing is that it's also interesting that not only has capitalism lost its mojo, but precisely in those countries where non-capitalist or state interventionist methods are used to the fullest extent, China being the most important example, you have an economic expansion. We can have now a huge debate about whether China is capitalist. I tend to think one should not call it capitalist, otherwise one is missing something important. I'm not saying it's socialist, I'm certainly not communist, but the fact that it's ruled by a communist party makes a big difference. So I don't know whether that... and the reason, by the way, I still think that while our eyes are fixed on M-, remember, production has not gone away. It's still around. Okay, and if it were to cease, if M-, became the main thing, we would all starve and die. Okay, so production is still happening, and enough of it is taking place on a capitalist basis that talking about this, what the passages I chose, is still important, because in order to understand why M-, is a symptom of the crisis of this activity, you need to understand what's happening, how surplus value is extracted, etc. Because M-, cannot generate surplus value on its own. All it can do is it can skim off surplus value produced by others, by other capitalists, and of course in our own time, it actually always, also by workers, workers' incomes also. So it can skim off incomes, whether they are profits or wages, that are the result of these activities. So it is parasitical, yeah? And sometimes parasites can kill the host as well. But at the moment, anyway, and it is certainly harming the host, but yeah. So, yes.
Okay, so I missed the first part of your talk, but I'm just wondering, in terms of a while back, you talked about the ways in which ultimately there will be more demand for labor, right? But how does increasing automation and technology mitigate that? And also the massive warehousing of labor, because I tend to understand the prison industrial complex, at least within the context of the United States, as warehousing labor, not only those who have historically been politically dissident, but also sort of the structurally unemployed class, so the surplus labor, right? So it seems to me that mitigates or kind of challenges this idea that ultimately there will be more demand for labor, insofar as we're warehousing the labor we already have, and also automating that labor we're rendering them redundant, right? So I just wonder if you can address that. And also thinking about M prime, and that M prime is representative of an underlying crisis. I'm thinking about the period between 1830 and 1840, and the ways in which the securitization of enslaved populations represented an expansion of enslavement from 1840 to 1860. So I wonder if you can speak to was there an underlying crisis to that to that regime of accumulation, or was that simply a method of expansion? Right?
You mean in the American South?
In the American South, exactly.
Look, I mean, in the American South, I think you are the pundit here, and not me. So I will do my best, but please feel free to contest my interpretation. Well, okay. So let me take it in order. Warehousing. I think that as far as labor supplies are concerned, and this goes back to the earlier question about tenure track and sessional labor, etc. in universities. I would say that actually the dynamics are very, very complex. Okay, let me just rattle off a few things that I use to think about this. Okay, so number one, in the post-Second World War period, the big sort of golden age, long boom, etc., actually capitalist economies needed more labor. I don't know if you've heard about the Windrush controversy in the UK right now. It's fascinating, but the British capitalists and governments were recruiting labor from the Caribbean because they needed labor, and also so that's one thing. Also, I would say that by the 60s already, Western countries were also importing labor to loosen up their labor market and weaken the power of capital. I am not one of those, and this is where I disagree with Brenner. I don't agree with him that there was no challenge to capital from labor. I would say that in the post-Second World War period, labor markets got tighter and tighter, labor got more and more militant, they demanded more wages, social services, you name it, the whole panoply of issues, and that is why the neoliberal reaction took the form of an outright attack on labor. So I would say that labor has been through a period when it has been a big problem for capital. And loosening the labor market via immigration is one key way. Let me come to warehousing. I think that actually, remember, capital is not exactly the most solicitous tender of society. Basically, it creates a society in which systematically there are a number of losers, and important sections of the population end up in this situation of essentially not becoming qualified to be reliable workers. And then they get warehoused in the way that they do. But at the same time, migration continues. Now, this migration also takes place under very contradictory circumstances. So on the one hand, they want this labor. Entire parts of the southwestern and southern United States economy would collapse if it were not for these illegal migrants. What is it that Donald Trump called them recently? Animals, he said. Wow. But anyway, he needs these animals. Sorry, I'm being ironic, but he needs these people to come. Let me just finish. They are needed now. So they are allowed in, but at the same time, a high decibel anti-immigrant rhetoric, racist rhetoric, is kept up so as to keep the labor market segmented. Do not allow solidarities to be built across these different categories of workers, which goes back to also tenure track, non-tenure, etc. I mean, all of these things, across gender lines, racial lines, whatever. So I would say that migration plays this double role, okay? And also, even today, like in Canada, for example, we don't have such an anti-immigration thing, but that's partly because employers keep bellyaching about skill shortages. I don't even think there are skill shortages. There are shortages of workers who will work at the wages they are being offered. Okay? And why shouldn't there be? I mean, some of these wages are pretty pitiful. So all of these things are going on at the same time. And so I would say that the issue of labor, migration, etc. is highly politicized. Also, there's a wonderful book which unfortunately doesn't go far enough, but it gives one an insight. Saskia Sassen wrote many years ago Guests and Aliens, and I think her fundamental point also obtains today, although she stopped her study at 1914. I don't know why. For so many Western writers, 1914 is a kind of sacred point. People don't want to go beyond that. We can discuss that. But anyway, maybe too many black people appear on the scene after that, so it's a big problem. But I would say even today, that idea that any migration route is the work of both the sending and the receiving country. Mm-hmm. Yeah, both authorities. When Mrs. Merkel, everybody talked about Europe's migrant crisis a couple of years ago. Well, it only began after Mrs. Merkel said, "We'll take 1 million of you." Yeah. She said that and the flow began. Why did she say that? Because German capitalists want to loosen up the German labor market even more. Because they have been engaging in these, rather late in the day, these neoliberal labor market reforms and so on. And so they want to disempower labor even more. So in the midst of all this, what should labor's response be? It should be to unionize the least powerful workers. That if you don't, and it's not happening yet. This goes back to capacity. That's how you would build capacity. Because unless you do that, all your struggles are useless, honestly. I mean, the point you guys were making, in our university I belong to a trade union, but my trade union does not include some of the least qualified workers, and we don't work well with them. When I criticize them, I basically get, I'm put in the doghouse. I'm still in the doghouse because I criticize them, but there it is. Labor, migration, all of these things are big problems. And the connection, the fact that there is a very large black and other minority population in prisons in Canada, the native Canadian population is in the same situation, is because the state simply can't be bothered to invest in the work capacities of its own people when it can so easily import migrants, right? So that's, and then of course it's all the more useful because you can pit them against one another, right? So unless labor finds a way of overcoming these divides, we're not going anywhere in terms of getting any closer to socialism or progressive change.
So, just listening to you go through these chapters and these moments again that we've read and read, one realizes how simple it is and yet how much it does explain. On the labor thing, and it's not in the chapter, there's this wonderful Marx footnote that could be part of an opera where a capitalist, let's call him Smith, moves all his fixed capital and his machines to Australia and brings a whole bunch of workers with him from England, sets up the factory, goes there, and the workers run away because there's all this land that they can grab from other people and start to farm. Nobody wants to work, even though the guy is screaming, "Come back, I'm a job creator," or whatever. So, it's all there. The need for the reserve army of labor, the fact that there is any real alternative, how are you going to keep them down in the factory after they've seen Paris or whatever? So, again, that's just a footnote, but, the whole labor situation seems to be there in that.
No, absolutely. And there's the old story about Cecil Rhodes, it's not that they don't want to work. They're working in their own fields. They don't want to work for somebody else to create surplus value. And why would anybody, right? If they had their own means of production. And when Rhodes goes to what is now Zimbabwe, he basically thinks that everybody's going to come running to work on mines and whatever plantations and so on, and they don't. Because, as you say, Africa, if you think about it, even today, it is an underpopulated continent. Then, it was even more so. People had plenty of their own resources, their communities, their own ways of living. They had enough. Why would they go and work for anybody else? What does he do? He imposes a hut tax to be paid in cash, so that every family had to discharge at least one person who would go and work for money for somebody else in order that the tax would be paid. It creates a need in them that they did not have before. So this goes back to that point.
So people have to be remade.
I just remembered that I didn't answer the question earlier about... I'm afraid I'm going to mispronounce your name. Sharon, right?
Yeah, I just think it as a pun.
Yeah.
I do it all the time.
So the thing about slave labor is that, in Marx, actually, there's considerable discussion. You know that Marx interested himself a great deal in the Civil War and the issue of the emancipation of the slaves, etc. There is this wonderful book that Blackburn has come out with, which I haven't read, which is about the Marx-Lincoln correspondence.
Yeah, the Civil War letters.
Yeah. So anyway, so the thing is that he basically, well, there are two, my understanding goes like this. Marx basically pointed out that there are real limits to increasing productivity in a slave mode of production, because if you treat a slave as subhuman, then he or she is going to produce subhuman levels of labor. And so there is this long, wonderful passage where he says that, he reports somebody else saying that we can only give the crudest and rudest implements to slaves because, otherwise they will destroy them, etc. And why not? If I was a slave, I might do the same myself. So there is that element. But I would say there are a couple of other elements which are also equally important. I think that the Civil War was certainly, in an important sense, it was about the emancipation of slaves. But it is because it was not just the emancipation of the existing slaves that mattered, but it was a question of whether slave society would expand westward or settler society would expand westward. So these were the two options. And there was a third very, very important point whose understanding, I think, is very limited. And that is that there was a big difference between North and South in another way. The South was free trading. And it was free trading because it was led by what we would otherwise, what dependency theory later would call a comprador bourgeoisie or comprador ruling class. A comprador ruling class is only interested in exploiting its own favored position without improving production, productivity, etc. And they like free trade because this allows them to supply cotton to distant Manchester, import the finest European products, silks, wines, etc. And imagine they are an aristocracy to match the European. And it allows them to live that. Whereas the Yankees, they were different. They wanted to industrialize. They didn't want to be an agricultural appendage to Europe and enjoy their position. They wanted to industrialize and create a similar level of production, productivity, etc. for protection versus free trade. The North wanted protection, the South wanted free trade. And that was the other big issue in the Civil War. And the Northern victory then, no wonder, led to a big industrial boom after that.
Yeah, to sort of bring relate to my former comment about simple things, but to bring it into the discussion we just having. I love your image of the fact that you put rabbits in a box, and there'll be more rabbits after a certain amount of time.
Because they're life after all.
If you put money in a box and you come back, it's going to be the same, even though capitalists speak as if it has this self-generative power. So when we think about that all-important primitive accumulation chapter, or so-called originary accumulation, to do it, to give the title as it should be given, we have a lot of meta levels in that chapter. We start off with Smith's notion of how it's done, which is this La Fontaine fable about the frugal ant versus the riotous grasshopper. That at a certain point, suddenly, this is how this large pile happened. The other guy spent it all, but the other one kept piling it up. Boom, capitalism. So the second thing, the counter story to that is, first of all, it's wrong historically. Capitalism comes into the world dripping with blood, and we go through all of the things that those of us who have in Latin American studies, as I was, or people in post-colonial studies, understand something about how capitalism operates in the rest of the world. But there was a lot of plunder going on. So if you want to understand how that big pile got there, it's not from somebody being frugal. On the other hand, it's just a pile right there. It's the same pile. And there have been piles of plunder for many years, from Roman times or so forth. And that's not doing anything more. It's not a rabbit in the box yet.
Yep.
So something else is missing for it to become capitalism. I mean, historically, when you look at the Spaniards who came back with all that gold, they wanted to be gentlemen. They did not want to be... They were hidalgos, impoverished hidalgos, who wanted to buy a palace, import Italian art, and then just live a life of luxury for the rest of their lives and have a court around them. They didn't want to throw it into production and have M come back as M prime. So we don't have capitalism yet. So in the other parts of that chapter, the primitive accumulation chapter, what seems to be important is this almost accidental conjuncture of 5 or 6 things that came together at one time where something new emerged. this emergent quality. You can trace any of these things, like the existence of money, back to antiquity. But until they enter in combination with all these 5 other things, and Althusser has a very nice portrayal of that in his book on his essay on the encounter, with the notion of the rain coming together. Things come together which don't necessarily take hold and could as easily not take hold, but in this case did. I think that's what we get in this chapter. So we have to read that chapter richly, both as an incomplete post-colonial account of the actual historical settlement of the world, which needs to be amplified and is being amplified by the work of plenty of historians from everywhere now, but also a very canny account of a capitalism that has an origin and will, because it has an origin, hopeful sign, can have an end, because it's not the eternal principle of trucking and barter that will be with us forever that we can't get rid of. So, we always go back to that notion of money in the box, because it's still very, very hard to differentiate capital and capitalism from other forms of oppression and exploitation that have existed going back to antiquity. And so when we want to get to the differentia specifica of capitalism, we have to figure out how M becomes M prime, and how that circuit keeps going around.
Yeah. Okay, so you've made a number of points, but I want to first pick up one that relates back to this whole question of warehousing labor and generally the supply of labor. Remember, we began by saying capital is a relation. Right. Capital is a relation because it doesn't matter what a big hoard you have. If you're just hoarding gold, let's say, you'll just be King Midas. So what? What are you going to do with this gold? It's useless. Right? You have to have a way to invest it in such a way as to appropriate unpaid labor. The only way to appropriate unpaid labor is when there is a supply of free wage labor, labor freed from its connection with the land. And this process was long, and in the early days of capitalism, Maurice Dobb talks about it, there is a substantial reason to believe from the writings of people who were writing at the time that it wasn't being freed fast enough. And people were even saying things like, we should not execute criminals, let them work. We should not incarcerate so many criminals, let them work, etc. So all of these proposals are being made because labor is not forthcoming fast enough. That's point number 1. Point number 2, I would say that one thing that, everybody talks about how, capitalism today is despoiling the third world, right? It's exploiting it, blah, blah, etc. But few people actually remember that actually consider the possibility that the third world may have made a contribution to the industrialization of the first world in the first place, in the early days of capitalism. And I would say I would say 2 things. Number 1, Utsa Patnaik's work shows, so this is a Marxist economist from India, her work shows that there is every case to be made that had it not been for surpluses coming from India and other such colonies, but India was very big, so it has to be placed in the middle, from India, then the level of investment which was already quite low. I mean, if you consider the fact that China is investing 30 and 40% of its GDP per annum, the level of investment of 5 or 6% during the Industrial Revolution is nothing, it's piddles. But even this level would not have been where it was, and that had it been any lower, substantially lower, which it would have been without Indian surpluses, the pace of investment would have been so slow that the process would not have deserved the name Industrial Revolution. That's point number 1. Point number 2. Surpluses extracted, I've written several things recently about the so-called gold standard, including a thing I did on Keynes's account of it in Indian currency and finance. Anyhow, what all of this research has showed me is, sometimes I joke, I say that, the system of the international monetary system between circa 1870 to circa 1914 is generally referred to as the gold standard, but I wouldn't call it the gold standard because it had very little to do with gold as such, apart from the currency being being pegged to gold. It had very little to do with gold as such. If you really were to name it on the basis of its actual mechanism, you would call it the colonial standard. If I was not from India, I would propose we should call it the India standard. So that was a joke. But the point is that it is surpluses extracted from India, from the Caribbean and other such colonies, which were taken to London and then exported as British capital exports to countries such as the United States, Canada, and other settler colonies. And this is, of course, the boom period of their industrialization. So if you think about it, the industrialization of both Britain and her offshoots, which includes the United States even after her independence, this has been financed by the colonies, right? It's because without this capital to export, these countries would not have industrialized, and there would have been no gold standard, because this was Britain's only way of providing liquidity. Yeah, this is key point. Yeah.
And just let me just finish the last addition off to say that whatever happened at the beginning to what is happening now in capitalism, indentured servitude is back, slavery is back, and so forth. Capital now has a million ways to accumulate at the end of the value chain. So we have to go back and revise our theory of how essential free labor is to capitalism.
Yeah,
but
no.
But I'm saying it might be possible that the invention of free labor was needed to bring the elements together, but it's not needed any longer.
I'm not so sure about that. First of all, let me tell you that we all think that M does not need labor, or that when you automate things, you don't need labor. This is rubbish.
No, I free labor rather than slave labor, indentured. Yeah.
Well, all right. To some extent, I think that, again, just as Marx assumes the exchange of equivalents in the market, he assumes free wage labor, but he also is very aware that there are all forms of extra economic coercion involved in many types of labor. He was never unaware of that. The purpose of this is not to say that all capitalist exploitation is only this. It is to say that in addition to all the other ways of exploiting, this is the specifically capitalist method of exploitation. So if there is a differentia specifica, it is here. But Marx was never under any illusion that there were many other mechanisms involved. And so even automation may push labor further away, but labor never goes away. Okay,
right.
And also if I were to add one more thing, one of the things I feel particularly sad about is that many Marxist economists have what I would call a Marxist understanding of capitalism, but what I would call a Schumpeterian understanding of capitalism. For them, capitalism is a Promethean system. It is prodigiously productive. It produces and produces and produces, and it will go on doing so. And no socialism can ever match it. The idea, which is embedded in the 1859 preface, that all class-based sources of forms of social production will ultimately fetter the forces of production, is absent. For them, capitalism poses no fetter. In fact, it only increases the forces of production. This is rubbish. We are living already in times when the capitalist organization of all forms of automation, of IT, in ICT, etc., is already preventing us from more fully exploiting the possibilities contained in this. Yeah. Let me just make a small point. It's maybe very simple, but today we have the capacity to automate to such an extent as to substantially reduce work time for a lot of people. But as long as it is organized on a capitalist basis, as a human society, we cannot fully enjoy the fruits of it, because the way capitalism does it is it makes overwork for some of us and makes vast quantities of people semi or unemployed, right? Semi-employed, unemployed, etc., etc. And if this is how you do it, then the system is constantly under threat, right? You can't have a stable system, right? So I would say that the possibilities for realization of the full potential of science, technology, automation, etc., will not be realized in capitalism. It's simply a stupid way of doing things. And I would say one other thing. I think that in terms of what most people, I've now realized after many years of teaching these things, don't understand is the difference between value production and use value production. Right. Value production means that imagine Seattle needs 2 more hospitals. Under a capitalist system, all of you have to wait around for somebody to find it sufficiently profitable to build a hospital. Under a non-capitalist system of direct use value production, you can call it socialism, you can call it communism, you can call it pink flamingoism. It doesn't matter. But
I
under
like pink flamingoism.
you like it, no?
Yeah.
So you simply say, well, we need 2 hospitals. Let's build hospitals. You don't have to pay for somebody to make a big profit. One final point. M' is so unstable that at the moment it looks very successful only if you look at how the people at the peak are faring. But if you consider the sheer amount of money that needs to be thrown into the system in order to eke out these returns, I would make 2 points. Number one, as more and more money is seeking a return without producing surplus value, it's therefore M', there is less and less to skim off of, right? So what then that means that margins get ever thinner. As margins get ever thinner, you need more throw weight to throw into any speculation in order to get a certain absolute amount of M', right? Or dash, whatever, the increase. So what happens is that the mutual funds, savings, deposits of the rest of us are used by the Bill Warrens and the George Soroses or whoever it is that as throw weight. But when push comes to shove and there is a crisis, they get their golden parachutes and our pensions are reduced. Right? So there is a pecking order in finance which is totally political. It has, by the way, finance is completely political. Money is not a commodity. Marx is very aware of this. Polanyi says it explicitly. Money is not a commodity. And every monetary and financial relationship is a political relationship. Right? So, and in that sense, yes. But they still need surplus value to skim off, somehow or other. Value produced elsewhere to skim off. So, that's it.
Well, I think we're all, everybody can come up and